While in Florida, I visited this beautiful beach. And what caught my eye specifically are these high rise buildings. The geologist and the engineering geologist within me began to question how is it possible that these buildings can be here, knowing that the water table is relatively high and the nature of the sediment is not most ideal. This is the Sunny Isles beach. So, doing my research, I came across the Miami Herald, and this article stood out. December 11, 2025, amid construction boom, experts urge for monitoring of sinking South Florida towers. Now, this was a question that began to surface in my mind, obviously, before coming across this article. How is it possible that these high-rise, multi-story buildings could be placed or could be situated along these coastlines of Florida? As this article highlights, at 750 feet, the St. Regis is said to be the tallest building in Sunny Isle, studied by 200 feet deep piles. And in the context of the engineering challenge, there exists a degree of settling, and the degree of settling is troublesome for engineers, according to this article. This is whereby the weight of the building is compressing the soil years after construction would have taken place. So, being on the beach, as you can expect, I am going to be playing around with sediment. And I came across this bivalve fossil that indicates that this is basically carbonate sand. This was also supported by me coming across some corals. And myself and my daughter digging into the sand. We didn't dig too deep to realize that we are coming across some wet sand layers. I would mind you that the berm or inland to this layer is not really that far from where the seawater meets the beach or the coastline. So, in essence, the water table is relatively high, and it means, therefore, that the engineers will have to be drilling 200 feet, which basically is within the saturated layer where the water table is concerned. Now, as Google AI highlights, some of the projects using piles extends in the region of 27 to 61 meters, 90 to 200 feet. Now, if you're just like me, you should be able to realize that this is very deep of a foundation. And then now it's a case where we have to understand what it is that is required to assist again with soil stabilization. That in addition to soil piling, there more than likely has to be soil mixing, and basically there will have to be a degree of compacting of the soil or the sediment to support the foundation itself. But then the other question has to be sand, water. What about earthquake and the effect earthquake can have as regards to settling? Well, Florida, as per this source, highlights that it is not known to be in a seismically active region of the United States. So, in other words, it is relatively okay for these kind of monstrous buildings to be present along this coastline or within this state. In terms of the probability, it is basically highlighted by the United States Geological Survey that Florida is basically a geologically quiet zone. Now, in comparison to Jamaica now, I can see that the buildings, the monstrous buildings I observed in Florida is coming like 2 times the height of the Bank of Jamaica building. And that's me being conservative. I know it gives understanding and gives a greater clarity as to why, say for example, in Jamaica's Kingston waterfront, the buildings may not be so high. And one of the critical components is that Kingston waterfront is located near to the seismically active planting garden fault zone. Kingston waterfront is located near to Port Royal, known for its disastrous earthquake, which has sunken segments of Port Royal back in the pre colonial era. So, with this being highlighted, this reality, geographically and engineering wise, gives insight into why Jamaica's buildings may not necessarily be able to go as high rising as those that I would have observed along the Sunny Isles beach in Florida. This also gives indication as to why geology is critical in terms of understanding and in terms of the engineering practices that can be developed. And it is also significant that the regulations are in place so that engineering practices can be relatively safe. Notwithstanding all that I've highlighted, Florida does have its own engineering challenges. As Google highlights, sinkholes are the reality that you may have, the groundwater being impacted, and it's also a case whereby we have to take into consideration that there are the hurricanes and storm surges. Those realities present engineering challenges in the context of sediment movement, in the context of water forces and erosional forces, and in so doing basically having to create buffers in its engineering towards safeguarding and mitigating against building damage and or other engineering related hazards. This just highlights that whilst there may be similarity in terms of geology, there is just the same difference, and with that difference presents the engineering challenges that Florida versus Jamaica has as a reality. Jamaica, Florida does have similar geology in its carbonate zones or in its limestone, but because Jamaica is located more within a tectonically active region, Jamaica's limestone is much more deformed relative to that of Florida. Florida being more in a quiet area, geologically speaking, in the context of seismic activity, gives it the greater capacity to have its engineers test the engineering length of building tall skyscrapers without worry of settlement due to earthquake forces. And even though Jamaica, in its regulatory systems, may not necessarily be considered that of a first world standard in comparison to the United States, the reality of the professionals or the experts being somewhat ignored as regards to engineering practice is still relatively being the reality in both Florida as well as Jamaica. So, with that being said, it gives insight into the reality that hazards, geo related hazards, may not be greater in terms of the risk factor in Jamaica's case versus that of Florida, given the reality that in both geographies, the geoprofessionals or the advice provided by the experts are not entirely being adhered to. So, with that being said, this is basically giving indication that there is still much work that is needed in both geographies towards ensuring that the safety of the public is fully maximized.